Hidden camera footage of Paula Hitler, alias Paula Wolf. She lived on Social Security on her own. Only a few locals knew who she really was.
For decades, she lived in quiet obscurity under a false name, hiding from the weight of a surname that could destroy her. Paula Hitler, Adolf's only sister, carried secrets she never dared share. Until, near the end of her life, she decided the truth could no longer die with her. What could she have seen that history never recorded? What memory haunted her for more than 80 years? Today, we uncover Paula's final revelations, intimate, unsettling, and unlike anything in the history books you've read before. A sister in the shadows. When the war ended and the world tried to piece itself back together, Paula Hitler slipped quietly into a life most would never notice. She didn't give interviews to newspapers. She didn't write a memoir for profit. She didn't even appear in public under her real name. Instead, she became Paula Wolf, a name chosen to erase the one that carried so much infamy. It wasn't a grand disappearance. She didn't flee the country or vanish into some far-off place. Paula stayed in Austria, living a modest existence on a small state pension. She occupied an unremarkable apartment in a quiet town, the sort of place where no one looked too closely at their neighbors. Only a few locals knew the truth about who she was, and even those who knew seemed to agree that silence was the polite choice. This was the life she built, a routine of grocery shopping, paying bills, and walking home along streets where the shadow of her surname could not follow her, at least not openly. But that anonymity came with a cost. Every decision, every introduction, every scrap of identification had to be carefully managed. Her brother's name had not only defined her past, it was a threat to her present. And yet, Paula wasn't entirely free of him. Even after the war, Adolf's presence lingered in her life in ways she could not or would not sever. She accepted financial support from him during the years before his death, money that kept her afloat when work became impossible due to her identity. These payments were not large, but they were steady, a tether connecting her to the brother the world knew as a dictator, but she had once known simply as Adi. Her relationship with him was complicated. In public, she avoided political statements. She didn't attend rallies. She kept out of debates. But in private, there was still a thread of loyalty, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of survival, perhaps both. In her own words, she described him not as a slayer, but as a complicated man who had been the leader, even in childhood. Then, in 1959, half a century after the childhood days that she shared with her brother, and long after the collapse of the Reich, Paula agreed to something she had shunned for years, an interview. But not one with the media at large or a handful of journalists. It was a subdued affair. The recording was almost understated. Her voice was soft, their tone was calm and measured, avoiding sensationalism. In themselves, Paula's memories seemed harmless at first, childish memories of shared playtime, her brother's habit of taking the lead. But lurking underneath was an unsettling pattern that she either failed to see or dared not label. For in Paula's world, Adolf's ability to dominate was simply an innate gift that followed him, whether way beyond the backyard to the battlefield. The 1959 interview became, to historians, a rare and valuable window into the events, the only first-hand account of their lives from a person who had grown up side by side with them. To the audience that listened to her, however, it became something strange and haunting. A sister speaks of her brother with affection and restraint, never directly condemning him, never explicitly defending him, but providing disjointed pieces of the puzzle others missed. Echoes of accusation never left Paula's mouth. She did not offer excuses for history. In the telling of her memories as told, Each was a thread that formed a tapestry far darker than she seemed willing to admit for Paula. Yet, as far as that was concerned, if she had ever uttered those words, anything that could go under the label of her story might have ended there. An insignificance to history now, a curiosity for scholars. In the months before her death, Paula began to speak in ways sometimes unrecognizable to her younger self. To understand why Paula's final words matter, and why they carry a weight no historian's analysis can replace, we have to go back to the beginning, to the house in Linz where the family's story began, and where a boy named Adolf first learned how to command a room without ever raising his voice. Childhood under a stern father. The Hitlers' home in Linz, Austria, was not a place of laughter and ease. Paula's memories of it are wrapped in the shadow of a man whose presence filled every room, their father, Alois Hitler. Alois was a strict, authoritarian figure, a man whose voice could still the air before he even entered the room. His temper was sharp, his discipline unyielding. Paula was young, only 6 when he died, but she never forgot the atmosphere he created. Papa's word was final, she would later recall. We didn't question him. We didn't dare. The rules in their house were clear. Obedience was expected. Authority was absolute. And emotions were to be kept tightly in check. There was no space for rebellion, no room for negotiation. And it wasn't just the children who lived under this order. Even their mother, Clara, a gentle and devoted woman, bent quietly to Alois's will. In this environment, young Adolf's instincts found fertile ground. He was not the eldest child, but among the siblings who survived, he became the natural center of gravity. Even in play, Paula remembered, her brother was always the leader. He assigned the roles in their games, set the rules, and made sure those rules were followed. He didn't have to ask twice, she said. We all just listened. It's easy to dismiss such memories as harmless childhood dynamics, but in the context of their home, they carried a deeper weight. Paula and her siblings were already conditioned to respect authority, and Adolf was learning not just to accept that authority, but to wield it. In the microcosm of their family, leadership was a role that demanded obedience, and he stepped into it without hesitation. With the death of Alois, the household changed in many ways that Paula had not known to expected. The ironclad order did not vanish, it merely was displaced. My brother was different after Papa died, Paula remembered. He grew quiet, but when he did say something, we all listened, even Mama. This was the moment, in her telling, when authority became unspoken but undeniable, belonging to Adolf. There were no theatrical proclamations, no formal grabbing beholden. Subtle was rather the rebalance, the household wherein he became the one making the decisions, the one who got deferred. For a young boy, it was an unusual position. He was still a child, but now an anchor in a family, in a loss situation. His word carried weight, not because he forced it, but because everyone, apart from Paula, accepted it. Paula didn't mention it as something threatening. It was simply the way things were for her. Her tone in recalling those years was matter-of-fact, almost affectionate. She seemed unaware of, or simply reticent to mention, the stage being set by these patterns for something much, much bigger. The grief from losing Alois additionally made the emotionally thick bond that already existed between Adolf and their mother, Clara, if anything, even denser. She then leaned on him in ways she'd never thought she could, not just for aid with the household, but for an entirely different kind of emotional stability. Paula saw all this with admiration and acceptance. He was no longer just her brother. He was a figure of quiet command in their home. After all, it was the crucible from which he emerged solidified under the shadow of a stern father, and then in the vacuum created by his death. And when the next blow came, their mother's illness, That unspoken authority would become something even stronger, the ability to take control in the face of tragedy. Loss, leadership, and hardening. Clara Hitler had always been the quiet warmth in a household defined by order and restraint. Where Alois demanded obedience, Clara offered comfort. She moved through the home with a gentleness that Paula remembered with tenderness decades later. But even that warmth could not keep the shadows from creeping in. When Clara fell ill with breast cancer, the rhythm of life in the Hitler household changed. Paula described it not in dramatic words, but in a simple image. The house got quieter. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with worry. Adolf was still young, but the shift in him was immediate. Paula remembered the moment he told her their mother was dying. He didn't cry. He didn't falter. His voice was steady, his words plain. "It was Adolf who told me," she said. "He took charge. He made arrangements." Those arrangements were not grand gestures, but they were deliberate, ensuring the doctor visits were handled, speaking to neighbors when Clara could no longer, and taking on the small but necessary duties that keep a household running when its heart is fading. For Paula, this was more than just a brother stepping in. It was the solidifying of a role he had begun to fill since their father's death, the quiet authority, the one who took control when no one else could. But there was something else, too, an emotional distance that seemed to grow in proportion to his responsibilities. He was attentive, yes, but never openly grieving. While Paula found comfort in moments of shared sorrow, Adolf seemed to resist them. In her telling, it was as if he believed showing grief was a weakness he couldn't afford. He focused instead on practical matters, as though emotional expression would slow him down. With Clara's passing, Paula had witnessed a change that would never completely turn back. "He hardened," she simply said. It was not that he ever stopped caring. Rather, he learned to put his pain behind a wall that nothing could penetrate. Historians often attribute Hitler's emotional restraint, even coldness in later years, to these formative losses, where loss has taught him that control is safer than vulnerability. In other aspects, this change was deeply personal for Paula. She had lost her mother. She had also lost a piece of her brother. From that point on, the protection he offered her was always an ordered type of protection, rather than one that offered any comfort. His instinct was to tell her what to do if she faltered. He bustled through any hesitations. So it was for Paula. She accepted being bidded for. She had never known him otherwise. Those years after Clara's death made Paula completely dependent on Adolf. He was more than just a sibling to her. He was her dependency, her anchor, her guide, her authority. And while she didn't say this was controlling, clearly his role in her life became precisely an armor and a place she could not cross. During those years, the foundations of their adult relationship were laid. Paula as the obedient sister and Adolf, without question, as the designated leader for her. It was one relationship born out of loss, sustained and tempered by discipline, and the unexpressed understanding that she would follow his lead. But there was much more to come in time regarding the fellow bond, much more so when the great Adolf himself thought of a journey. For with a dream turning very sour, Adolf left Linz for Vienna, thus adding to the growing emotional distance between them, but still tied with an unbroken string. And in the years that followed, that thread would carry not warmth, but the first hints of the bitterness that would come to define him. Bitterness Paula would read line by line in the letters he sent home. Letters from a darkening mind. When Adolf left Linz for Vienna, Paula stayed behind. She remained in the small apartment that had once held the bustle of family life, but now sat mostly in silence. Her connection to her brother became something fragile, carried across distance in carefully folded envelopes. At first, His letters still carried traces of the young man she had known, the dreamer who wanted to study art, the boy who once sketched in the quiet corners of their home. He wrote of the city, its streets, its buildings, and the way the light fell over the river. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to shift. The dreams became fewer. The grievances multiplied. Paula noticed the change, though she didn't name it at the time. In place of talk about his art, Adolf began to write about the obstacles in his path. The professors who dismissed his work, the critics who didn't understand, the faceless forces he believed were standing in his way. Each rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts seemed to cut deeper, and each wound was stitched together with a thread of resentment. My brother was always sure someone had done him wrong, Paula later recalled. He never failed. It was others who failed him. The words on the page grew heavier. He began to speak in absolutes, framing the world in black and white. Right and wrong. Victim and oppressor. And in his telling, he was always on the side of the wronged. Paula didn't argue with him. She didn't write back with challenges or questions. She accepted his narrative, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of the same instinct that had always led her to defer to him. The brother who had once taken charge in moments of family crisis was now taking charge of his own story, and Paula, as always, was listening. How could she ever guess that the very letters contained the beginnings of a worldview that would engulf entire nations in time? To her, they were thoughts from that brother, struggling to find his place in a city that seemed bent on repelling him. She did not see bitterness as something dangerous, but rather a frustration. Yet, even then, there were grim undertones to his unyielding stance toward the surrounding world. The focus of his writing had moved away from beauty to the discussion of enemies. Rather than construction, the preoccupation had become destruction. His writing, even the rigidity of his handwriting, deliberate and acute, seemed to echo that hardening which she had first detected after the passing of their mother. The crucible of ideas that were still being birthed was, for Adolf, very much in the making. His being turned out from the academy did not only mean the closing of a door, but the choking of his perspective. Paula, for her part, went about her work in an almost cathedral-like silence in rooms that were shared with others incidentally. She made her living. He was inventing a narrative in which survival was not even on the horizon, that victory alone was just on the other side. Their lives were widening apart, but still, the emotional thread between them remained. He still signed his letters with warmth. He remained proud of her work. Even that pride, conditional. Years later, she would drop a clue about a moment when that pride was put to the test. In taking a job at a Jewish dormitory, a detail she never elaborated on in public, perhaps sensing how much it could have strained their relationship. But, for the moment, there were still letters. And with each letter, the young man who once wanted to be a painter was fading away. Instead, here was a man who seemed convinced that the universe was colluding against him, and who was quietly preparing to become a man ready to retaliate. And while Paula may have sensed the tension in his words, the true rupture between them would come not in ink, but in a single devastating moment, when her own identity became a liability she could no longer outrun. A name she couldn't keep. By 1930, Paula Hitler had been living quietly under a slightly altered name, Paula Hitler. It was a small change, just enough to pass casual inspection, just enough to let her work without raising questions. She had found a place at the Austrian State Insurance Company, a modest job that gave her structure and a measure of independence. To most of her colleagues, She was simply another employee, polite, reserved, and efficient. They did not see her as the sister of a man whose political rallies were beginning to draw dangerous attention. But secrets like hers do not remain hidden forever. The truth came out quietly, not in a scandal splashed across newspapers, but in the whispered conversations of supervisors behind closed doors. Someone had learned who she really was. In the political climate of the 1930s Austria, the connection to Adolf Hitler was not yet the full burden it would become, but it was already heavy enough to make employers uneasy. Her dismissal was swift, final, and unceremonious. There were no accusations, no confrontation, just a notice that her position had been terminated. The reason was never stated outright, but it didn't need to be. Paula understood. When she told Adolf what had happened, his reaction was immediate and sharp. "Disappear," he told her. "Use the name Wolf. Vanish." To obey meant surrendering more than a job. It meant giving up the last public trace of her real self. Paula Hitler ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. In her place stood Paula Wolf, a woman without a public past, without a surname that could betray her. The alias was more than camouflage. It was erasure. For Paula, the loss of her name was the loss of her history, her identity, and her ability to be known for who she was apart from her brother. But the choice wasn't really hers to make. The order had come from Adolf, and in their unspoken family hierarchy, his word carried the weight of law. He had made arrangements to ensure she could spend her days without the necessity of work, but probably out of generosity, while more importantly, making her reliant on him by dependence on his will, tightly bound by the very connection she was meant to be concealing. Paula became a ghost in public. She shunned attention, didn't talk to strangers, and left no traces of her existence in official records. She learned the careful art of blending into places and passing through them unnoticed. She had mastered the art of silence. But silence has its own weight. To live under an alias entails much more than dodging inquiries. It also means dodging replies. She would not be able to speak openly about her past, her family, or the brother whose name had served as both her shield and her bane. For Paula, living in the shadow of a rising man was actually not just about mere survival, but almost at points contained within it. To move further and further above, she had to shrink into smaller and smaller dimensions. But she kept on his side. She accepted his money. She saved all his letters, and she carried the name Wolf as armor, but she knew it was also a cage. That was the paradox of her life. She needed to disappear to be safe. But to disappear, she must play a role assigned to her by him. Still his sister, still bound by the loyalty she offered, yet now also an artifact, a fiction written for her own protection and for his easy convenience. And yet, in the years to come, even as she lived under this false name, Paula would find herself entangled in a relationship that would pull her dangerously close to the very machinery her brother controlled. A relationship that ended as abruptly as it began. The strange engagement. For decades, Paula Hitler's life seemed to drift quietly along the edges of history, invisible under the name Paula Wolf. But in 2005, long after her death, historians uncovered a detail that would send ripples through the study of her life. A secret engagement she had never spoken of publicly. The man's name was Erwin Jekelius. On paper, he was a doctor. In reality, he was something far darker. A key figure in the Nazi euthanasia program, a state-sanctioned machinery of death that claimed the lives of more than 4,000 people deemed unfit or undesirable. His work was not only known to the regime, it was celebrated by it. How Paula met Jekelius remains a mystery. Perhaps it was through social circles quietly aligned with her brother's inner world. Perhaps it was by chance. What is certain is that they became engaged. An astonishing connection for a woman who had spent so much of her life trying to stay clear of politics, at least outwardly. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Adolf intervened. The exact reasons have never been confirmed. Records show that upon learning of the engagement, Adolf Hitler had Jekelius arrested and sent to the Eastern Front, a posting widely understood as a death sentence. In the brutal winter campaigns against the Soviet Union, few survived. Jekelius didn't. Paula's own words about the event were few, and they carried the weight of both bewilderment and resignation. "My brother was always watching," she once said cryptically. "I never knew why the engagement ended so abruptly. I never saw Jekelius again." There have been historians who have investigated the possible motives behind Hitler until today. Is he motivated by shame, a desire to keep public eyes away from associating his sister with a man whose atrocities might come to be perceived as tarnishing that family image in the eyes of their allies? Or perhaps jealous or possessive, so that he will not have to share that influence over Paula with any other people? Or was it something colder, calculating, with the idea that he could control every thread of the narrative surrounding his family? In truth, it could be all of these things at once. Adolf was a consummate master at designing public perceptions, both for himself and the people around him. Every association was weighed for its potential political cost, every relationship. And while Jekelius was as good as gold for the regime, having him sewn so tight to the Führer's very own sister may well have proved too dangerous for his taste, an unfortunate risk that Adolf would evade. For Paula, it would have shattered everything. She had already sacrificed her identity and independence to the shadow of her brother, and now even her personal life, the opportunity for a future with one of her choosing, would be subject to his approval. After the removal of Jekelius, she did not speak of him again. There were no public displays of grief, no letters hinting at her private feelings. Whether she felt relief, sorrow, or some complicated blend of both, only she knew. But her silence speaks to a pattern that had been present since childhood. When the parameters were set by Adolf, Paula complied. She didn't battle him, not openly. Perhaps one of the most haunting mysteries in Paula's life. This engagement seems to remind her that discord of her brother's shadow dominates her life, no matter how hard she tries to live in anonymity. Even love, it seems, was something he could take away. And as the war drew to a close, that reach, once an unspoken bond between siblings, would become something she could no longer escape, even when the world around them was falling apart. Denial, silence, and the final truth. The war's end left the world picking through the wreckage of what had been done. For Paula Hitler, still known to most as Paula Wolf, there was no escaping the shadow of her brother, Adolf. The Allies arrested her in Austria, interrogating her about his character, decisions, and crimes. But her account clashed with what history now knows. "I barely saw him," she insisted. "Once or twice a year at most." She claimed to have met Eva Braun only once, denied knowledge of politics or atrocities, and declared, "My brother was not a murderer." To some, it was naive loyalty. To others, willful denial. Privately, her notebooks revealed a more complex truth. She recalled the sting of her brother's punishments after their mother's death, the fear his temper inspired, and the way his presence commanded silent obedience. Yet, she reframed these memories. Cruelty became care, authority became protection. This was not ignorance, but a psychological shield built over decades to protect herself from the unbearable truth. Accepting what Adolf had become would mean dismantling the core of her identity: loyalty, dependence, and lifelong love for her brother. In the years after the war, Paula avoided politics and the memoirs, living discreetly off a small pension. She granted only a few interviews, and even then, she spoke with great caution. At no time was there any defense of her brother's ideology, but commitment to open condemnation was equally absent. Instead, she offered fragments: the games of childhood, the illness of their mother, and Adolf's innate power of leadership. Historians have become skilled at reading between those fragments. The pauses in her speeches, the hesitations, and the incidental admissions painted a far clearer and compelling picture than did any outright accusation. That unshakable certainty, the silent command of obedience, the very ability to multiply himself and shape reality. Those were hardly meant as warnings, but they serve as such. Paula never spoke of him as evil. She never uttered his name with hatred. The truth lay in the gulf that spanned what she said and what she could not bring herself to say. In those last years of her life, Paula lived in a small village in close proximity to Berchtesgaden, with the Bavarian Alps vaulting above her like silent witnesses to her seclusion. Paula disposed of yet another alias and went into ciphers under her new name. The neighbors were polite and reserved, but had no idea who she really would have been.
And here was this very demure, simple, quiet lady, a total and complete contrast. I couldn't believe that this foul creature had this little woman as a sister. I mean, it was the absolute opposite to everything we've ever heard about Hitler.
On June 1st, 1960, Paula Hitler passed away, with hardly a whisper from the public or any confessional memoir. She never stormed at the past in any melodramatic fashion. But her interviews and private writings, scattered in the form of fragments, survived as evidence to her enigma. She loved her brother deeply, but lived in the long, uninterrupted shadow of what he became. It was not an empty silence. It carried with it truths that she couldn't convey or chose not to convey. An ending denial, perhaps self-preservation. Paula Hitler's life was one of silence, heavy with love, fear, and the unbearable truth of who her brother became. She never fully condemned him, yet never escaped him, leaving us to wonder, when someone you love commits the unthinkable, do you turn away or keep seeing the child they once were? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and join us next time as we uncover more untold truths from history's shadows.